Hey, how you all doing? My name's Matt Crape, and I'm going to give a quick talk about an intro to disaster recovery and business continuity. Just a few notes about myself. VMware VCP, VM Vanguard, VM Champion. You can find me on Twitter at Matt.ITGuy. I'm an IT manager by day, and I've got a passion for technology. So the reason why I approached this topic is I felt like it's something that a lot of IT professionals might be familiar with regards of, oh yeah, we have a DR plan or a BC plan, but a lot of folks may have never had to design one from scratch. So my intent was to keep a high level overview, not so much focus on the software that you could use for failover and all that sort of stuff, but rather focus on how are we going to build this plan out. So to start, let's take a look at the difference between disaster recovery and business continuity. DR typically comes down to how do I get my data back? You might be in a situation where a crypto locker hits you, or you have a malicious admin who's deleted all the files. You need to get that data back. It's a disaster. Business continuity, on the other hand, has much more to do with how is the business impacted, how can the business keep going. So this would be an example of, let's say, an e-commerce website going down. They need to get their websites back up and running to keep the business going. So how do you know which one that you need to use? Typically, DR is part of a BC plan. You're usually trying to solve a disaster, and because of that, you need to put your BC plan into play. So the first thing you want to do is some sort of triage. For those who aren't familiar with that term, it's basically a way to assess the damage and figure out what you should prioritize on. So you could basically assign values for services, say take things like web or email or accounting and give them a priority rating of 1, 2, 3 and say, okay, 1 is most important. We always have to work on that. Another very common way to do it is with service level agreements, SLAs. A lot of us are used to that from our internet service providers. If we have, let's say, a fiber connection that gets cut, they'll say, hey, we'll get that fixed in 4 hours. So if you work with a business unit within your organization, they can really help you figure out your SLAs. They might say, no, email is critical, we need an SLA of an hour. And that sort of ties into the idea of RTOs and RPOs. An RTO is recovery time objective, whereas an RPO is recovery point objective. So you really want to use these when you're designing your plans, because they will have a direct impact on how much data is lost, how quickly you can get back up and running, as well as cost, because a lower number for both of those, there's more it's going to cost you. You also need to understand the dependencies of the services when you're doing the triage. So for example, if, going back to the e-commerce website example, let's say your databases are down and your web servers are down, but the web servers get all their information from the database servers. There's no sense in bringing the web servers up first because they're not going to be doing anything. If you get the database servers up and running, well, then there might be other business units that depend on those as well, and they'll be functioning. So as far as resolving problems, things to consider is who owns each service? Is this an internal service that a business unit owns? Are you running something for a client? Is it a partner? So figure out who owns these things so that you can notify them, let them know that there's issues. So what are the steps to fix it? You need to have it documented how do we get things back to a working condition. Whether that's looking at backup software and documenting how to use that, or another very popular way to do it is if you keep all your configurations for, let's say, your Cisco switches, your Apache web servers, keep all those configurations in some sort of repository where you can just pull them down quickly. So if you need to rebuild, you could do that. Or if you just need to compare against what's changed, you could do that. You also want to make sure that you have baselines defined. So if you get a web server back up and running and it's returning an OK status code, but it takes 2 seconds normally, and after a DR situation, you get back up and running, but now it's taking 10 seconds. If you have that baseline, you know that, hey, something's still not quite right here. And that could be an impact of the SLAs, and that might be something to consider. Hey, we could get you back up and running to 50% volume in an hour and 100% in 4 hours. Another consideration is purchases. who's authorized to make these purchases. If you have a fire on site or something and need to buy new server gear, network switches, are you okay to just go out and buy it? Do you have to go through a certain vendor? Do you have existing contracts in place? If not, who do you basically call up to pay the bills? Internally, externally, wherever. So get those things hammered out before you need them. Some general considerations when you're designing either one of these plans is see if you can script as much as possible. So this is a little more on the DR side, but when you're able to script these things, it eases with the testing. There's less thinking involved when you're under pressure. So you're also going to get more consistent results. You're not going to have someone sitting there freaking out, typing bad commands or something. You'll want to keep this documentation as long as any sort of scripts that you use for configurations, contact info, all that out of band. There's no sense in saving it on your file server if your file server is all of a sudden hit with CryptoLocker. Won't do you much good in that regard. You also want to have a good list of key contacts. So this will include people within the business, the CXO level execs, managers, business unit leaders, people who are stakeholders in projects. But there's also external contacts that you should have in there, right? Your ISP, data center locations. If you have multiple data centers for failover and whatnot, make sure you have their address documented because maybe not everyone knows where it is, or it's been 5 years since they've been there. Also consider folks such as contractors, HVAC, electrical, plumbers. If you come in and all of a sudden you find the pipe has burst in your data center, well, if you have a plumber who's on hand, retainer, whatever, makes it a lot easier than just pulling out the yellow pages and looking for the first guy, A1 plumber. And who's authorized to make decisions? So who makes that call when it's time to fail over to the DR site, or when you have to fail over from service A to service B? If you could define all that stuff before you need it, you're not going to be in a situation where you're sitting there arguing in the room trying to debate, hey, when do we make that decision? So some key takeaways here are define the scopes, such as, what I mean by this, when is it an application problem versus when is it a server problem versus when is it a site problem? Each of those will have different impacts as far as which way you go. Get the business involved. This is especially critical for the business continuity side of things. You need to make sure that you have your bases covered. What you may perceive as a high priority may not be high for all the business units. Let's take email, for example. Once again, if you're an e-commerce website, email is important, but having your web servers up is even more important. So make sure that you sit down and you figure out these nuances, because as IT folks, quite often we may not be 100% up to speed on the way the business works. Lastly, test. Testing will help you find those nasty surprises that you wouldn't otherwise find, and believe me, they exist. But it should also be a living document. And what I mean by that is it's not something that you spend 3 months working on, you save it, give it a nice title page, and then you put it on the shelf and never look at it again. No, if you're testing it, you should be pulling out that manual, going through the different areas, making sure things work as expected. A great example of how you can make it a living document, look at something even like using GitHub or Gitbook. You're able to push the incremental changes up there. If somebody screws up really bad, you can revert. But that also solves the issue of making it accessible if you're hosting it on a service such as that. So once again, there's my contact info. If you're looking to find me, feel free to reach out about this or anything else. I love chatting to folks. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Cheers.